Well, I think we'll make a start. Numbers are still coming in, still joining, but I think we'll get going as I've got a few matters to start off with just to get us going, and hopefully people can keep joining as I'm speaking. First of all, hello to everyone, and thank you very much, and welcome to the Clean Arctic Alliance's webinar on the IMO's draft Arctic heavy fuel oil regulation, a ban in name only. As we get started, there's a couple of housekeeping matters. Please note the information on the slide, and in particular the fact that we're going to be recording this webinar and then hopefully making it available to others to view afterwards, those who aren't able to join, or if anyone wants to watch it for a second time, they're welcome to as well. And then secondly, if you've got any questions during the presentations, could you please use the Q&A button option? If you can, indicate to which speaker the question is directed and submit your question. We will endeavour to answer all questions during the Q&A session, but we're not going to take any questions until the end of the webinar. And we'll try and take all the questions that have come in during the final session. However, if we do run out of time, we'll follow up with a response after the event. First of all, I'd just like to spend a couple of minutes providing a little bit of background to the webinar, and then I'll introduce our speakers. More than 10 years ago, the Arctic Council's Protection of the Arctic Marine Environment Working Group concluded that the most significant threat to ships in the Arctic marine environment is the release of oil through accidental or illegal discharge. And a follow-up report by DNV, Det Norsk Veritas, identified that ships using distillate fuel instead of HFO or heavy fuel oil would achieve significant spill risk reduction. The use of heavy fuel oil in the Arctic poses risks not only to the marine environment and to Arctic wildlife, but also threatens food security, livelihoods, and the way of life of Arctic coastal communities. A heavy fuel oil spill in the Arctic would be devastating, both for Indigenous communities, the resources they depend on, and for Arctic wildlife and ecosystems. A heavy fuel oil spill can have both acute and long-term consequences. Distillate fuels tend to evaporate and disperse faster than heavy fuel oil, while heavy fuel oil emulsifies and demonstrates a strong tendency to form tar lumps in marine waters, making it more persistent in the environment. A later study commissioned by the Arctic Council to demonstrate the different behaviours of HFO and diesel spills in cold water environments resulted in 90% of the heavy fuel oil remaining in the ocean 20 days after the spill, while the marine diesel oil took only 3 days to nearly completely disappear from the surface. The cost of cleaning up a heavy fuel oil spill in the Arctic will also be very high. A small spill on the southern end of Shuyak Island, Alaska, just outside of the IMO-defined Arctic waters area, it was around a ton in volume, cost approximately $9 million to clean up. 3 years ago, in 2017, a submission to the IMO's 71st Marine Environment Protection Committee meeting from 7 co-sponsors, including 5 Arctic states, set out the compelling need for new work to be undertaken to develop measures to reduce the environmental risks of the use and the carriage of heavy fuel oil as fuel by ships in Arctic waters, not least because of the projected increase in future vessel traffic in the Arctic, which is expected to increase the risk of an HFO spill. Earlier this year, the need for an Arctic HFO regulation was agreed. However, it is envisaged that another 9 years will pass before it becomes fully effective. Today's webinar takes an in-depth look at the draft IMO Arctic HFO regulation and the impact and consequences of a heavy fuel oil ban in the Arctic. We have 4 speakers, starting with Dr. Brian Comer with the International Council on Clean Transportation. We'll then move to Melissa Johnson from the Bering Sea Elders Group, followed by Troels Jacobsen with the Association of Arctic Expedition Cruise Operators, and finishing with Danielle Grabiel from the Environmental Investigation Agency. We'll move straight from one speaker to the next with just a brief introduction between each. You can, as I said earlier, you can submit questions at any time. please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, but they won't be answered till the final session of the webinar. So I'm going to move straight on then with our first speaker for the day. Dr. Brian Comer is Senior Researcher with the International Council on Clean Transportation's Marine Programme. Brian's research informs policies that reduce the environmental and human health impacts of air pollution from marine vessels and ports, including black carbon. He is a leading expert in heavy fuel oil use and black carbon emissions from ships in the Arctic, and his research has informed the IMO's ongoing policy debate on banning heavy fuel oil in the Arctic and regulating black carbon emissions from ships. Brian will be speaking on the likely impacts of the IMO's proposed Arctic HFO ban and how it could be improved to reduce a larger share of HFO and black carbon emissions. Brian, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Sean. I'm going to share my screen and pull up the presentation. We're seeing this in full screen now?
Yes.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for being here. I'm excited to share the results of some recent analysis that my group, the International Council on Clean Transportation, just published earlier this month in a white paper on the impacts of the IMO's proposed Arctic heavy fuel oil ban and how it can be improved. I've included a link to the white paper on this title page, and this presentation will be circulated with anybody that would like it after the webinar. I'd like to thank the Clean Arctic Alliance for inviting me to speak, and I'll move on to our results here. So back in 2018, Finland, Germany, Iceland, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Sweden, and the United States proposed that the IMO ban the use and carriage for use of heavy fuel oil in Arctic waters. And I'd like to highlight one quote from that submission, which is here in blue, where they say that a single HFO spill could have devastating and lasting effects on fragile Arctic marine and coastal environments. And also Arctic shipping is projected to increase, which would further increase the risk of a spill. And because of this, the ban on HFO should be implemented as soon as possible, and any delay should be short-lived. And in today's presentation, I'll be explaining that the proposal that we ended up with back in February 2020 at the IMO's Pollution Prevention and Response Subcommittee meeting contains exemptions and waivers to the ban that really mean that it's not going to be effective at reducing the amount of HFO that's carried, the amount of HFO that's used, or the amount of black carbon that's emitted in the Arctic until these exemptions and waivers expire in 2029. So while the ban is scheduled to enter into effect in July 2024, it really allows HFO to continue to be carried and used, and black carbon emissions to continue to increase for the rest of the decade. I'll briefly introduce our methods, and I won't go through this slide word for word, but you can read it here or in the white paper itself. But basically, my group used Arctic shipping data from 2019 and methods consistent with the IMO's fourth greenhouse gas study, of which we're co-sponsors. And we analyzed shipping traffic in the Arctic as defined by the IMO in that year, and how effective the proposed ban would be in reducing HFO carriage, HFO use, and black carbon emissions, taking into account proposed exemptions and waivers in the text that we ended up with from PPR 7 in February 2020. So the proposed HFO ban that was agreed at PPR 7 is supposed to enter into effect in July 2024, but it includes exemptions and waivers. The exemptions allow ships that have protected fuel tanks, meaning that their fuel tank is separated from the outer hull of the ship, to continue to use and carry HFO until 2029. So it's a 5-year delay. There's also a provision for waivers, meaning that any ship flying an Arctic flag that's operating in waters of their flag state while in the Arctic can be issued a waiver to continue to use heavy fuel oil in the Arctic for the remainder of the decade until July 2029. So this is another 5-year delay, but it applies to ships of any type, any size, whether or not they have protected fuel tanks, as long as they're flying an Arctic flag and operating in that flag state's waters. We'll show that the waivers could apply to about half of the HFO-fueled fleet in the Arctic, and over 90% of that would be to Russian-flagged ships. We assume that all ships eligible for exemptions and waivers would use them, and that ships would not reflag or alter their routes to take advantage of the waivers clause, although in reality, we expect that if the waivers clause continues to be included in the text of the ban, that ships that are not eligible for an exemption, meaning that they don't have protected fuel tanks, will apply to reflag to the Arctic state in which they typically operate, further eroding the effectiveness of the ban. We also assume that the 0.50% sulfur, quote, very low sulfur fuel oil, would meet IMO's definition of heavy fuel oil by viscosity, density, or both. These are the fuels that are being used globally after the beginning of 2020 to comply with IMO's global fuel sulfur limit. And we believe that VLSFO would qualify as heavy fuel oil based on a statement by the International Bunker Industry Association that was given at PPR 7, where they said that over 93% of samples of fuels of this very low sulfur fuel oil would meet the IMO definition of heavy fuel oil by density or viscosity or both. So getting into the results, we found that from 2015 to 2019, heavy fuel oil use in the Arctic has increased 75%. And that's just over a 4-year period. So heavy fuel oil use and also the carriage of heavy fuel oil in the Arctic has been increasing rapidly. And the proposed HFO ban doesn't enter into effect until July 2024. So we predict even more heavy fuel oil to be used and carried in the Arctic without the ban until it enters into effect in 2024. So we can expect the risks of an HFO spill to increase in the years to come. We also found that black carbon emissions, which warms the Arctic by direct atmospheric warming, but also when it settles on Arctic snow and ice, it helps it melt by absorbing sunlight. Emissions of black carbon from the heavy fuel oiled fleet have increased 72% from 2015 to 2019, and black carbon emissions from all ships in the Arctic have increased 85%. So it's a worrying trend. We found that due to exemptions and waivers, the proposed HFO ban would only eliminate 30% of HFO carriage and would only ban 16% of the heavy fuel oil used in the Arctic. This would reduce black carbon emissions by only 5%. And so calling it a ban is really not accurate. By the time this HFO ban enters into effect in 2024, we expect that even a smaller share of HFO carriage and HFO use will actually be banned, because these results here assume that the ban was applied to ships in 2019. And it's based on the number of ships that would already qualify for an exemption or a waiver. And over time, more and more ships will have protected fuel tanks and will qualify for an exemption. And ships could reflag to Arctic states in preparation for the ban. So really, this is the best case scenario here, is that 16% of HFO use would be banned starting in 2024. And we've mapped this out. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see actual 2019 HFO use in the Arctic, and the Arctic is defined by the blue line. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see the amount of HFO use that would remain under the proposed ban. And due to exemptions and waivers, there's only a 16% Arctic-wide decrease of HFO use. And you can see that there's hardly any difference between the amount of HFO used and the patterns of its use in 2019 on the left, compared to what we expect to continue to be allowed to be used on the right. Under the ban, we expect that the Russian flag ships will benefit the most. In 2019, 2/3 of Arctic heavy fuel oil use were by Russian flagged ships. And under the current language of the ban, less than 3% would actually be prohibited. The rest would be exempt or waived. And it's represented here in this top bar. And the orange portion is the amount that would be waived. And the red and orange hashed mark shows that even if the exemptions clause were eliminated from the text, the rest of those ships could still qualify for a waiver, because most of the Russian flagged ships are operating within Russian waters and would be eligible for an exemption, for a waiver. We also found that oil tankers account for 40% of Arctic heavy fuel oil use, and less than 2% of their heavy fuel oil usage would be banned under the proposed ban, with the rest exempt or waived. Most of the oil tankers are serving Russian oil and gas development, and most of them are Russian flagged. So it's really not, these exemptions and waivers to the ban are benefiting ships that are engaged with resource extraction, like oil tankers and bulk carriers, and not those that are resupplying Arctic communities. And it goes against what the initial debates were at IMO on, trying to make sure that we protect Arctic communities from increases in prices. So it's really these ships that are benefiting, not those that are resupplying northern communities. And what's particularly worrying is that between 2015 and 2019, HFO use by oil tankers and bulk carriers has increased. And there's been almost over a fourfold increase in the amount of HFO used by oil tankers over this period. And bulk carrier HFO use has increased 70% over this time. So here's, again, the map of the proposed heavy fuel oil ban, and it shows you where heavy fuel oil would continue to be used in the Arctic. This is under the ban. You can see that there's heavy fuel oil being used throughout the entire Arctic, and I've tried to identify here the types of ships that are dominating heavy fuel oil use in these different areas. You can see bulk carriers serving Red Dog Mine in Alaska at the top. Between Greenland and Canada, you can see bulk carriers that are serving the Baffinland Mine in Canada, general cargo ships in Hudson Bay, container ships and cruise ships on the southern tip of Greenland. And on the right-hand side, you can see the oil tanker traffic in the Russian Arctic. So only 16% of HFO use banned under the proposed text. So we considered several different alternatives to the ban and mapped out exactly what the patterns of heavy fuel oil usage would look like under alternatives. So the first thing we asked was, well, what if we got rid of the exemptions, but we kept the waivers? In that case, 64% of the HFO carriage would be banned. You see a reduction in the number of bulk carriers that are using and carrying heavy fuel oil in the Arctic, because many of those ships are flagged to non-Arctic states like Panama, Liberia, Marshall Islands. But we still see heavy traffic, especially in the Russian Arctic and especially from oil tankers on the right-hand side of the map. Okay, so how about we still allow the waivers? We don't allow any exemptions, but we limit the application of the waivers to just the territorial seas and internal waters. In that case, we ban 70% of HFO carriage and 75% of HFO use. Shouldn't say but only, should say 75% of HFO use. So that's quite good. From a global Arctic perspective, that's good. We've reduced the amount of HFO carried and used substantially. But the warning here is we've now shifted where ships are using heavy fuel oil to the near coastal areas. And these are places where if there is a spill, that there's more likely to be a direct impact on Arctic coastlines and communities. And we should note that with the Wakashio oil spill in Mauritius, that was 1,000 tons of heavy fuel oil that was spilled. The ship was using very low sulfur fuel oil, but it's clear from what we've seen that it's behaving like HFO, and it's likely that it would have been defined as heavy fuel oil by density or viscosity. And in that spill, that was 1,000 tons. In the Arctic, in 2019, we had 555,000 tons of heavy fuel oil used within the Arctic. So a typical bulk carrier is carrying thousands of tons of heavy fuel oil, 2,000 to 3,000 tons. And a typical oil tanker in the Arctic, 3,000, even 4,000 tons of fuel. And so there's some serious concerns about the risk of an accident and what its impacts could be. And obviously, we've concluded that a heavy fuel oil ban without exemptions and without waivers offers the most protection. This is our figure from our executive summary. At the top, I've highlighted no exemptions and no waivers, which would ban 100% of HFO carriage and 100% of HFO use. Black carbon emissions from the HFO-fueled fleet would fall 44%, and black carbon emissions from the entire Arctic fleet in that case would reduce 30% in that scenario. So a conclusion slide and then our recommendations on the next slide, and that'll be it for me. We concluded that the proposed Arctic heavy fuel oil ban as written bans only 30% of HFO carriage and 16% of HFO use, and would reduce black carbon emissions by only 5%. And it's the exemptions and waivers in the proposed ban that undermine its ability to substantially reduce the risks of carrying and using HFO in the Arctic. And what's worse is that as newer ships are entering the fleet, especially oil tankers and bulk carriers, more ships will qualify for exemptions. And if ships reflag to Arctic states, more could qualify for waivers. And if either of these happen, the effectiveness of the ban is further eroded. A ban without exemptions or waivers is the most protective. And also, we find that limiting the scope of exemptions and waivers would reduce the risks of using and carrying HFO in the Arctic. But moreover, it would be consistent with the original proposal for the HFO ban, which stated that it should be implemented as soon as possible and that any delay should be short-lived. Based on this, we have 3 recommendations for IMO policymakers. The first is to eliminate or limit the exemptions. If they are included in the final text, they should expire well before 2029. We should also eliminate or limit waivers. And if they're included, they should be limited geographically, or even better, reserved for ships that are engaged in community resupply. Or even better, governments could support the transition to cleaner fuels with a clean fuels fund and not have any HFO used for community resupply. And lastly, the ban should be implemented as soon as possible before July 2024. So thank you very much for your attention. My email is provided here, and this presentation will be circulated to those who would like it after the fact, but feel free to reach out with any questions you might have by email as well. And thanks very much.
Thank you, Brian. And I see we've got a couple of questions already, but as I said, we'll keep those till the Q&A session at the end. We're going to move straight on to our second presentation. Muktoyak, also known as Melissa Johnson, is Executive Director for the Bering Sea Elders Group. Muktoyak is Inupiaq and originally from the community of Nome in Alaska. She has a strong passion for protecting and respecting and maintaining traditional ways of life. Her upbringing in Nome with her grandparents and many other elders, along with inspiration from her 3 children, drives Melissa to work to revitalize and promote different cultural aspects of life, from arts and crafts to traditional food preparation, and from land and sea preservation to language revitalization. Melissa is passionate and motivated to advocate, educate, and share with others the importance of preserving and maintaining Indigenous ways of life for the Bering Sea region of Alaska. Melissa, you have the floor.
Thank you. I am going to share my screen. Can you all see it okay? Okay.
That's it, thanks, yeah.
Okay. All right, so Uvlulotak, good afternoon, good day. My name is Melissa Johnson. I am Executive Director of Bering Sea Elders Group. The mission of Bering Sea Elders Group is to speak and work together as one voice to protect and respect our traditional ways of life, the ocean web of life that supports the resources we rely on and our children's future. So shown here, for those of you who may not be familiar with the proximity of Alaska to Canada and to Russia, is a map indicating, the Arctic Ocean, the Bering Sea, Pacific Ocean, and the three countries, Alaska, Canada, and Russia. So zooming in just a little bit is a map that was created for Bering Sea Elders Group. These are all of the community, or majority of the communities that make up Bering Sea Elders Group. And there is no split between, Yupik, St. Lawrence Island, Yupik, or Chupik peoples. We are all indigenous to this area. And it's the guidance of our elders who are appointed by their tribal councils to represent Bering Sea Elders Group. So going into the impacts to our indigenous way of life in relation to food security. Many of the foods that we rely on come from the ocean and the coastline for those of us who live in the coastal areas. Foods such as greens, different berries, different types of fish, from salmon to halibut to other whitefish, and then also any marine life. As shown in this picture here is a bearded seal, or in Inupiaq we call it a ugruk. So the impacts to our way of life, if there were a heavy fuel oil spill that were to occur within our coastlines, anywhere from the community of Wales, Alaska, which is the one on your top left, to Nunavut, Alaska, which is a Yukon-Kuskokwim area community, there is significant lack of infrastructure to support a heavy fuel oil spill. A lot of our communities do not have access to, any type of vessel, and also there are lack of access to ancillary services such as running water, flush toilets, and then the convenience of a grocery store. So if a heavy fuel oil spill occurred, there's many disparities that can occur and continue to impact our communities that rely on subsistence foods as our way of life. So the next slide is you know, like with the sea ice diminishing throughout the years, there's increased vessel traffic and coming into the Bering Strait region, into the Bering Sea, from the Chukchi Sea. Should a heavy fuel oil occur, again, as I said before, that it affects our way of life. We do not have the luxuries to go to any stores. You know, if we don't get our spring or winter harvests, whether it be by hunting or gathering, we're not able to just go and, you know, get a replacement beef or chicken or pork or cabbage or carrots or apples and oranges and such. So our way of life is continued to be impacted by any minor heavy fuel oil spills or any major ones that could potentially happen in the future. So the efforts that are, you know, here today is that again, any heavy fuel oil spill that occurs, you know, it doesn't just impact people who rely on and live an Indigenous way of life. It can be detrimental to our heritage, our culture, our language, and our children's future.
Thank you, Melissa. I think, and so we'll move now directly to our third speaker today. We're very pleased to welcome Troels Jacobsen, who is the Field Operations Manager with the Association of Arctic Expedition Cruise Operators, AECO. With over 15 years experience in the cruise industry, Troels joined AECO as Field Operations Manager at the beginning of 2020 and has since been involved in developing and maintaining field operations tools, measures and procedures, as well as a wide range of field operations issues and guidelines for AECO and its members. Troels will be presenting an industry perspective. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Hope this works out. Yes, I think so. Thank you very much, everybody, yes, also for joining. Thank you for the Clean Arctic Alliance for having us, inviting us to this webinar to talk a little bit about Aikos, the support of the HFO ban in the Arctic, and how and why we handle that as an industry. Just for those of you who may not know who we are a growing organization. Have about 76 international members currently. In 2019, somewhat outdated number of vessels, but obviously 2020 has had its limitations in operations, and almost nothing has been going on, in fact, in our industry this year. So 41 operating vessels in 2019, but we do expect the growth, fairly significant growth in the next 5 years with new vessels being built. We are an industry organization, and we are very keen on ensuring the environmentally friendly, responsible, and safe cruise tourism in the Arctic. And of course, we are a lobby organization, an industry organization, and working on the interests of the AECO members. Just to define the AECO, or the expedition cruise operations versus other tourist vessels that may be around in the Arctic, I do not represent everybody. We are fairly small vessels, and normally the vast majority of the ships are between 100 and 200 guests, up to about 500 guests. We have very flexible itineraries, very nature focused, local community focused, So very high interest in pristine environment and close contacts with the local communities in the Arctic. So just to sort of be sure that that I'm not speaking for just everybody in this particular talk. We're not covering the entire Arctic at the moment. We have here the areas where the geographical area of Aikos. It's the National Park Russian Arctic, Franz Josef Land in Icelandic, Svalbard, Jan Mayen Island, Iceland, Greenland, Canadian Arctic, Nunavut, and Northwest Territories. Aikos is very much focused and based, all the work is based on our standards and guidelines. We have an extensive amount of guidelines these days, and still new ones are coming to sort of guide our members to do the right thing. They are all members, all guidelines are mandatory for members, and it varies and spans into wildlife guidelines, community guidelines, community-specific guidelines, which are made by local communities with our help, so that it's actually the local communities that make the guidelines and decide what's to be featuring in them. All sorts of things, operational guidelines, obviously as well, from which our HFO policy also is included in our operational guidelines. A bit of the time span for the cruise industry's HFO, the timeline, if you like. As it happens, many of our members are operating in the Svalbard area, and it was in 2007 that most of the protected areas of Svalbard would be had an HFO ban imposed, and that of course affected quite a number of our members already then. So a considerable time ago, actually. It could have inspired, I would hope so, that it inspired the Antarctic Treaty System to get into action as it banned HFO in 2011. And why I bring this one in is because most of our members are actually also operating in Antarctica in northern wintertime. So the HFO expansion, the HFO ban expansion in Svalbard in 2015 was not a big surprise or a big problem for our industry, as most vessels were actually already working on lighter fuel, so not so bad. And in 16, we made it sort of official from our perspective to support the ban, and we've also signed the Arctic commitment, but the Arctic frontier in 17, and in last year we approved at the annual meeting in October. We approved that we make a self-imposed ban on the use and carriage of HFO. We do have, I should mention that we do have a 3-year sort of grandfather period, so that we can, it's phased out over 3 years, so it ends in 2022. But I should probably mention that due to the fact that most of our operators are actually working in Antarctica, it is a vast majority of our vessels are not carrying HFO, and due to the very large exchange of vessels or addition of vessels, I'm fairly convinced that there will be a very, very few ships by 2022 in the expedition cruise segment that carries HFO. So what made us actually go to this place of banning something which is on paper, you know, may not be a beneficial thing for business, but it has there's a few things to it. Actually, I was myself active as an expedition leader and guide over many years, almost 10 years, and we got quite a number of questions from clients and guests about these things. There was a drive and a demand from guests to promote the pristine environment, to limit any sort of impact we may have, and that included the fuel oil that we carried. We spent quite a lot of time, and I'm convinced that all our members are actually spending quite a lot of time with the guests explaining these things. And of course, if there is a spill of any kind, but particularly the HFO spill, which we just heard was lasting quite some time before, I mean, years on end, it can be affected, an area can be affected. It could of course be extremely damaging for the industry, also on a business sort of scale. We would not be able to go to such a place and do the things that we normally do, see the things that our guests would like to see. So obviously that's we really would like to keep our operations for the future, and any such oil spills would not be exactly promoting that. And it is indeed an objective, official objective of Aikos to conduct environmentally friendly tourism. So there's a big drive from our members and from our guests to ban the HFO. So a level playing field is of course also of interest. It's not a very interesting thing for companies to have to jump from who operate in different countries to jump from one set of regulations to the next. So it would be of course nice for us as within the expedition cruise industry to have that level playing field between nations. So a ban would be very easy to sort of adhere to and understand. Of course, the entire level playing field between industries. So why would we be interested in having, say, the fisheries or cargo vessels also be included under this? Is again, the oil spill has a massive effect. It would be beneficial if everybody would carry the most environmentally friendly, if you can call that, fuel oil. And our core business essentially depends on the long-term sustainability, also from other actors in the Arctic. That's my little talk. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Truls. We'll turn first to our final speaker, but please, if you do have any questions for any of the speakers so far, do submit them on the Q&A button. But first of all, let's just go to our final speaker, Danielle Grabiel, who is an attorney with the wildlife team, is attorney and the wildlife team lead for the US Office of the Environmental Investigation Agency, a Clean Arctic Alliance member. Danielle is going to be giving some views on the draft IMO Arctic HFO regulation. Danielle, you have the floor.
Thank you, Sean. I believe a slide will be appearing as well. It's just a summary of some of the thoughts I'll be presenting. So in consideration of some of the issues that you just heard about in the previous presentations regarding the waiver provision specifically, the Clean Arctic Alliance sought the advice of outside legal experts on what the legal implications of such a provision might be. And the following is a summary of our concerns about the waiver provision in light of their advice. So first, we are concerned that the waiver provision will result in negative environmental consequences for the Arctic region because it allows for the differential treatment of ships operating in Arctic waters. As we heard from Brian, over 70% of HFO use and 36% of HFO carriage in the Arctic could continue as a consequence of the waiver clause after the regulation comes into effect. Ships flagged by one of 5 Arctic coastal states operating in waters subject to the sovereignty or jurisdiction of that state where they have successfully applied for a waiver would still be able to use HFO, whereas all other ships operating in the area will have to comply with a higher environmental standard. This means that the waiver clause, as currently worded, will result in 2 different environmental standards being applied in the Arctic based simply on flag. Such an approach is inconsistent with international approaches to protection of the marine environment, which are grounded in principles of fairness, non-discrimination, and harmonization. Such an approach is also not in keeping with IMO's strategic plan for the 2018 to 2023 time period, which acknowledges the need for, quote, a level playing field for all states involved in international shipping. It also leaves the Arctic coastal states in the potentially troublesome position of enforcing more stringent environmental protection for ships flagged by other countries than for their own ships. Second, we are concerned that the granting of waivers will result in the relaxing of international environmental standards in the exclusive economic zones, or EEZs, and territorial seas of Arctic coastal states. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, requires that flag states adopt regulations for their EEZs for the prevention, reduction, and control of pollution from vessels flying their flags, and that rules have at least the same effect as what are called generally accepted international rules and standards. Since waivers will have a diminishing effect rather than a comparable effect on protection of the marine environment, the use of waivers in EEZs raises important legal questions about whether the waiver provision is compatible with UNCLOS. Furthermore, we are concerned about the precedent that could be set by relaxing international environmental standards in territorial seas. Usually the approach in territorial seas is to adopt stronger and not weaker environmental standards than you see in the EEZs or on the high seas. And last but definitely not least, we are very concerned that issuing waivers will increase the risk of a catastrophic HFO spill in the Arctic, with a corresponding increase in the risk of transboundary harm. And I think that Melissa did a very excellent job explaining what's at stake. As we all know, pollution is not constrained by man-made legal boundaries. The international community has long recognized the risk of transboundary harm due to pollution at sea. UNCLOS requires states to, quote, take all measures necessary to ensure that activities under their jurisdiction or control are conducted so as not to cause damage by pollution to other states and their environment. We believe that the issuance of waivers by Arctic coastal states undermines both the letter and the spirit of UNCLOS, as well as one of the key objectives of the ban, which is to safeguard local coastal communities and the marine environment on which they rely. So in summary, the waiver provision raises novel and concerning legal matters, and we really urge member states to consider carefully the issues that I've just raised. And we would like to also point out that should the HFO ban be adopted as it is currently written, that the granting of waivers will be at the discretion of national governments. The issuance of waivers is not mandatory, and because they seriously undermine the effectiveness of the ban, it is our firm position that they should not be granted. Thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Danielle. Just before we turn to our question session, I would just like to thank all of our speakers for their presentations today. I really appreciate the time that they've given and the presentations that they've given us today. We've got a few questions. We've got plenty of time for questions, so please, if there's any more, do submit them. I think we've got 2 or 3 at the moment already, so we'll get going with those ones. And hopefully, I have mentioned it a couple of times, but there should be a button towards the bottom of your screen that says Q&A, and you just need to type your question in there and it will come up and we'll take them each in turn. I think the first question from Claudio Boesio, sorry, I hope I pronounced your name right, is directed towards Brian, though I think if others want to jump in, feel free. The first question anyway says, Regulation 12A and the requirement in the Polar Code for heavy fuel oil tank protection might be sufficient to protect spills in case of minor grounding or ice collision damage. But what about ship-to-ship collisions? Is there any scientific research this double hull arrangement is based on and proves its effectiveness?
Thanks. I can take a crack at it and others can jump in if I miss anything. It should be noted that the requirement is for at least a 76 centimeter gap between the hull and the fuel tank. So that's less than a meter. So I think it's right that the potential for damage still exists, even with a double hull or protected fuel tanks, however you'd like to term it. And On the scientific evidence for 76 centimeters exactly, I couldn't tell you. But I think we should recognize that in the event that there's a grounding or an accident where it's severe and where the ship splits in half, like we saw with the Salandangayu and like we saw very recently with the Wakashio bulk carrier, it doesn't matter if you have a double hull in that situation, it's going to spill. So I think we've seen recent evidence that even, in the event of a severe enough grounding or accident, the ships can split in half. And that doesn't really matter what protections you have around the fuel tanks in that situation. I think that's all I've got for this first question.
Thank you, Brian. Claudio has sent a few questions. Perhaps we'll go to the next one. Actually, it's related. And in fact, I'll say a couple of words perhaps to start us off with, and then maybe you'd like to follow up. The next question then is, the HFO tank protection is a passive measure only. The proposed ban does not include any active measures to help avoid grounding or collision damage in the first place. What are your thoughts about this? Well, I know there's a number of the Clean Arctic Alliance members who have worked extensively on the development and now the implementation of the Polar Code, which contains many provisions to try and ensure that shipping in the Arctic regions, in the polar regions, both the Arctic and the Antarctic, is carried out safely. And alongside the development of the proposed ban has been some work to develop mitigation guidelines as well, with the aim of applying the mitigation guidelines to those ships that would qualify for an exemption or a waiver. So there are other initiatives underway. Brian, I don't know if you want to come in and add to that as well.
I think others are probably more expert on the other measures that are trying to be taken to mitigate the risks.
Truls, do you want to add anything from Aikos' perspective on the measures that are put in place to prevent accidents happening with ships?
Well, I can try. It's I must admit this is not my field of expertise as per se, but as far as it goes, I can try it out. I mean, we are doing a lot to avoid near any contact between vessels. We have extensive sailing plans in place for where everybody, all ships know where all other ships are at any one given time, both via a booked system, pre-seasonally booked system. So everybody goes in online and book their sailing plans so they don't overlap with others. So everybody knows where everybody is. Additionally, there's a great sort of a spirit of working together in when you're out there in the field. So the competitiveness is more a thing in the really from home, not really when you're out there. So everybody helps everybody no matter what, really, and that also goes to whenever sites are double booked because of an accidentally double booked or the like. So we're really quite far away from each other at all times. It's not the expedition cruise industry is as I mentioned sort of living off the idea of presenting the Arctic as a pristine environment, and in that equation other vessels don't really go well. So we try to stay away from other vessels as much as we can. So I don't know if that's not a very technical answer, but it's at least a sort of a perspective, I guess.
Apologies, I clicked the button twice. It gives us some insight, so thank you for that. I'll come back to Claudio's questions in a moment and take a couple of other ones. Truls, this next one is actually directed at you. Chloe Scott says, really enjoyed everyone's presentations. My question is for Truls. What does Aikos see as environmentally friendly tourism taking shape as? Will it be possible to achieve environmentally sustainable marine tourism without the ban?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's also a very broad question, a big question. We, through our extensive set of guidelines, which are mandatory for our members, we are not only living up to the local legislation that may be in place in the various Arctic countries where we operate, but also going beyond and above and beyond that in many cases. And that the reason for that, of course, that we take that extra step is to try and be sustainable so that we have an industry in the future as well. I mean, we're not really interested in destroying our own way of business. So we're really trying very hard to be proactive. We do quite a number of things in terms of protection of various habitats, animal life, etc., flora as well. We are going, actually right now, we're in the middle of a process of investigating if our vessels not only or also could be used for vessels of opportunity in case of oil spills from other vessels, regardless of it being expedition cruise ships or cruise ships tourism or other vessels. If there's a chance that our members could carry additional specific oil spill response equipment and be able to help out. It's a project that we're looking into at the moment to see if that has any viability from our side, and as for the moment at least, it looks like there's an optimistic, positive approach there by our members. So I think there is a chance to have a sustainable tourism in the future in the Arctic. It does depend on everybody doing the right thing, and that's of course why we very much hope that new tourism operators to the Arctic in the expedition cruise segment, which is growing so fast, would become members. We have some good things going, we feel, and want to do the right thing.
Thank you. I'm going to take the questions out of order slightly so that everybody gets a chance at answering some questions, but I'll try to come back to ones I've skipped over. We've got a question here from Rodion Sulyanziga. Apologise if I mispronounced that. Melissa, do you have any relations with ICC representing Inuit under the Arctic Council to have their support and lobby efforts, including on the heavy oil issue, and in particular taking into account the incoming chairmanship? Russia is taking the chair over in 2021, and it's bigger, with Russia having the biggest role in increasing shipping and oil tankers and impacts. So what are the relationships like with ICC and other groups on the Arctic Council? Thank you.
Thank you, Rodion, for the question. Yes, I do have collaborative, relationships with ICC and also Quark Incorporated, who is based out of Nome, Alaska. And they are a couple of Indigenous organizations that have continued to support the HFO ban, because as Indigenous people, it's our way of life is not isolated specifically to one community. So what affects, one part of our Indigenous communities affects us all as Inuit people. And so yes, in regards to the question, and then, as far as relationships and continuing those collaborations, moving forward, the hope is, that as Indigenous leaders, we are able to, create opportunities for our organizations to not only participate in presentations like this, but also to support one another. And then I think there's a couple of participants on today's call who have previous experience in relation to the HFO ban.
Thank you, Melissa. Yes, I can see from the list Lisa, Stephanie, Austin, if any of you wish to speak, just say yes in the Q&A and we'll try and open up the mic for you. In the meantime, I'm going to go back to a couple of earlier questions. Brian, I know you've already responded to Hjalti directly, but others might like to hear the answer as well. So we had a question from Hjalti Hreinsson. Hi, Brian, where did the shipping data come from? What was the geographic scope? How many ships used heavy fuel oil and how many unique ships were there in 2019?
Sure. So we used 2019 automatic identification system data, which is the satellite tracking data for ships. We purchased it from a company called Exact Earth, and we paired it up with IHS market data that has ship characteristics information. So we can compare the IMO number that's in the AIS data with the IMO number in the ship characteristics data. And we use that information to identify the ship. So we know what ship it is, what kind of ship it is, and what kind of fuel it's using. The scope was the geographic scope was the IMO's definition of the Arctic, which is what you saw in all of the maps. It's also the same geographic scope as the recent Arctic Council Protection of the Arctic Marine Environments report on 2019 Arctic ship traffic from their new Arctic ship traffic database. We found a little over 1,700 unique ships, and 700 of them were HFO fueled. We define HFO the same way as the IMO. And it's important to know that HFO is defined as a heavy fuel oil either by viscosity or density, not both. So as long as it's greater than 900 kilograms per cubic meter, or if it's greater than 180 millimeters square per second, it's a heavy fuel oil. So you have to look at both of those parameters. 700 ships were HFO fueled under that definition, and our results compare well with the recently published statistics from PAIM's Arctic Ship Traffic Database, which we found 1,723 ships in 2019, and they found 1,725, so pretty close.
Thanks, Brian. And Lisa, I think your microphone is open if you would like to add to Melissa's response just now.
Sure. I'd just like to say, and in support of what Melissa responded to Rodion, and I'm with Inuit Circumpolar Council Canada, and we have been working very closely on this issue, and even participating in discussions in the framing or the formulating of the proposal to ban the use and carriage of HFO. So we're keeping pretty close tabs to it, and I want the listeners to know, and Rodion also to know, that we also made an application for membership with consultative status at the IMO, and we're hoping to hear of an answer soon there as well, so that we can have a proper voice as Indigenous people, and more closely influence and hopefully participate more closely as well in discussions that relate to the Polar Code, to the proposal, the wording of the HFO ban. I'm glad to see, and thank you, Melissa, for your presentation, and thanks for the question and for this opportunity to say a few words. Sean.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you. I'm going to go back now to Claudio's last question, and actually I'm going to try and attempt to answer this, and if anyone else wants to jump in, feel free. The question is, does the definition in Regulation 43 really cover any type of hazardous oil type? Now, at the moment, we have a definition of heavy fuel oil, or heavy grade oil, in fact, in Regulation 43 that is applied in the Antarctic area. And my answer would be that no, even that definition does not cover every type of hazardous fuel oil, and that at some point, at some stage, that needs to be revisited. It's not straightforward because the definition of heavy grade oil isn't just relevant to fuels used in the polar regions, it's relevant to other parts of the MARPOL Convention that deal with double hull requirements, etc. So I think to revisit the definition needs to be done strategically, bearing in mind the implications for all elements of MARPOL that, to which it is relevant. The definition in the draft amendment to Regulation 43 that would apply to the Arctic is even more limited, but it is limited because the proposed ban only covers the carriage of heavy fuel oil as fuel. It doesn't cover cargoes. The ban in Antarctica covers the carriage of cargoes as well. And I believe that was done because there were and are no intentions of carrying cargoes of heavy fuel oil in the Antarctic. So a broader definition didn't cause any concerns or problems. But the definition has been narrowed for the Arctic, so it is applied purely to fuel. But even in relation to fuel, there are other types of fuel that are considered hazardous, and even distillate, the lighter fuels, have a hazardous impact as well. So it is certainly not a comprehensive definition, but it's the best that we've got in use at the moment. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything to that. No. If not, then I'm going to go to a question from Ilko, directed towards trawls. Aikos is leading the way, so do you know what is needed to persuade the big cruise ships to shift away from heavy fuel oil as soon as possible?
Yeah, thanks for that one. It's this is a very difficult one. I don't think I can answer it in probably in any other way than we hope that we can lead by example. I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And I think we're probably heading towards our last question. In fact, we've got two left, so we'll try and take them both before we wrap up. I think we've just about got time. Question from Chloe Scott, and I apologize, I haven't even read this, so I'm not quite sure who it's going to be directed to yet. The Arctic Council's Senior Arctic Officials Marine Mechanism begins today to discuss enhanced cooperation and coordination on marine matters. Do you anticipate that these sessions will assist in Arctic states understanding the complexities of the heavy fuel oil ban and lead to better awareness and policy change?
Sean, this is Jim. I could take a swing at that.
Please do, Jim.
Okay, thanks, and hello everybody. Thanks for attending and for your really interesting questions. The SMM, the Senior Arctic Officials Mechanism, is a really interesting new development in the Arctic Council that sprung from sort of a multi-year process that started with a task force, the Task Force on Arctic Marine Cooperation, that looked at ways that the Arctic Council could sort of better integrate Arctic marine policy and Arctic marine activities better throughout the Arctic Council. Really, I think what the determination of the task force was that there needed to be a better sort of mechanism for communication between the Protection of the Arctic Marine Environment Working Group, PAME, and the senior Arctic officials. And so this idea of a senior Arctic officials marine mechanism was born, and now we're going to see it start, and we're going to see sort of where it goes from here. And to Chloe's question more directly, you know, I would really hope that what she mentions is exactly what's going to happen, that this mechanism will allow the senior Arctic officials to be more aware of and sort of better briefed on the complexities. I think the senior Arctic officials, as we know, have 6 working groups to cover. And so they're looking at activities and activities that shape policy from the ground up, but then they're also trying to communicate those to the ministers, and so pushing them higher within the diplomatic and the sort of the governing bodies of each country. And so there's a lot of work there, and a lot of topics that have to be covered. But I think the mechanism of the Senior Arctic Officials Marine Mechanism, that is the very idea for the more of the complexities to come through and for a better understanding of how marine activity integrates throughout all of the Arctic Council work. So anyway, I'm really hopeful that this will sort of make the HFO ban sort of more in the forefront of the senior Arctic officials' thinking and help them to better understand what it is and why it's necessary. So thanks for that question. I think it's a great one.
Thank you, Jim. Jim Gamble from Pacific Environment, who's another Clean Arctic Alliance member, for those that don't know Jim. Our last question then, and Claudia says it's the last question from him, but I think it's the last one we'll have time for today anyway. What is the time frame and the room left to get the ban to be changed or amended to a proper ban until it comes into force, before it comes into force?
Yeah, this is Brian. I can start off and maybe others want to add, but so the Marine Environment Protection Committee is the committee where the ban language will be approved. The MEPC meetings have been delayed due to the coronavirus pandemic. The next one is going to be held virtually November 16th through 20th, 2020. And as a consequence, there's very limited time to have a full debate on many of the topics that are on the agenda. The MEPC 75 virtual meeting will focus more on the greenhouse gas measures and less on other topics. But the draft text of the heavy fuel oil ban has been forwarded to MEPC 75 with a view towards approval, is how they put it. Unfortunately, because there's such a limited time, there's a real risk that MEPC 75 takes what came out of PPR 7 and approves it without any changes. This despite this research that we've put out, and this despite an MEPC 75 commenting paper from a group, from several environmental NGOs that are members of the Clean Arctic Alliance, that have explained the consequences of the exemptions and waivers, which were not taken into consideration in the impact assessments that the member states put together. And at PPR 7, the exemptions and waivers were agreed to without any consideration for the impacts on what it would mean for how much HFO was actually banned in the Arctic and how much black carbon it would reduce. So I think there's a risk that MEPC 75 agrees to the draft text without any changes. And that's pretty much the last opportunity to make meaningful change to the text. Once it's approved, it'll go to MEPC 76, which is yet to be scheduled, but should be sometime next year, likely virtual, for formal adoption. So this is really the last chance to make meaningful changes to the text, to either have the ban implemented sooner, limit exemptions, limit waivers, completely eliminate exemptions or waivers, change the timeline. It's the last opportunity in November. And it's up to the IMO member states. They're the ones who get the votes and who get the final decision-making power. We've briefed several of the Arctic states on this issue. And so we hope that they will take their responsibility to protect the Arctic seriously and take our recommendations into account to eliminate or limit exemptions and waivers and to implement the ban as soon as possible.
Thank you, Brian. And I know some people have seen it, but just to note that Stephanie Meakin has posted a comment as well that on the 8th of October, the ACSMM webinar will be on shipping, and the keynote speaker will be Lucas Contogiannis from the IMO, the IMO's head of marine pollution, just in case anyone hadn't seen that. Thanks, Stephanie, for that. Well, our time is up, and I'm afraid we must conclude our discussion on this important issue. The Clean Arctic Alliance believes that today's presentations have raised some really major concerns around the effectiveness of the draft IMO Arctic HFO regulation. It's been said already, but I'm going to say it again. The analysis has shown us that the regulation would only stop 16% of heavy fuel oil use and 30% of heavy fuel oil carriage when it comes into effect in mid-2024, as currently worded anyway, and that we would have to wait nearly a decade before the full impact of the regulation is felt and HFO use and carriage for use is actually banned in the Arctic. In the meantime, it's likely that the amount of heavy fuel oil carried and used in the Arctic will increase following the ban taking effect. And all this in the face of what's happening in the Arctic right now. You know, in this past year, we have seen the Arctic sea ice in July reach record lows. We've seen the Northern Sea Route opened up earlier than ever. And earlier this month, we've seen the Arctic summer sea ice extent reach its second lowest extent ever. The Clean Arctic Alliance believes that it is not acceptable to wait nearly 10 years before introducing an Arctic heavy fuel oil ban. It's already nearly 10 years since the ban was introduced for the Antarctic. To wait 2 decades to introduce a similar protection for the Arctic is just not acceptable. We do not support the ban as it's currently drafted, and we do urge member states, IMO member states, to modify the draft Arctic heavy fuel oil regulation before it is approved, and to make the ban a real ban that enters into force quickly and gives the Arctic the protection that is so desperately and urgently needed. We've actually responded to all the questions on the webinar today, but if anybody feels there are further questions or questions that we've not fully answered, please do contact us. Contact details are out there, they are available. And as I said at the start, it's our intention to make the recording of the webinar available, and we will circulate details very soon. So finally, may I once again just thank our panelists today, Brian, Melissa, Truls, and Danielle, and also thank the additional speakers. I'm going to leave somebody out if I try and name everyone, but Jim, Lisa, I hope I haven't left anybody else out. I do hope that everyone who's joined us today will be able to join us again in a couple of months when we look forward to discussing future action as working towards a ban on the use and carriage of heavy fuel oil in the Arctic. And what I'd like to do is just finish by thanking everyone for participating in this webinar. Thank you, and good night, or good afternoon, depending on where you are.